Hello and welcome to Psychological Insights. In normal parlance, we use the word anxiety, neurosis, dysfunction, and we use them most casually, but indeed they're not casual words. They're very well described and documented in the DSM, the Diagnostic Statistical Manual. But what about the word negative will? What exactly is that? Today, we'll be speaking to Dr. Robert Hamm. He's a psychologist in West Hartford Center. I'm Pat Kazakoff. Stay with me. Hello, Dr. Hamm.
Hey there, Pat.
So today's topic is unusual. It's negative will. We don't have any idea about what that is, whereas we do have an idea about what anxiety is, what neurosis, because we use it in everyday terms. And I noticed that in your blog, you started this talk with an example of Zelig. And I happen to be a Woody Allen fan, so I'm most interested in that. Why did you start this topic with Zelig? What relevance does that movie have to negative will?
Well, Woody Allen, I love his older movies. Not so much a fan of his newer ones, but Zelig is sort of an obscure movie by today's standards, unfortunately, because it was a very interesting concept about a man who, wherever he was, he would take on the physical characteristics of the people that he was in the presence of. So, for example, when he was in some congregation of rabbis, Hasidic rabbis, you saw him there with those, I guess, little curly kind of uh, curled up side of payas.
Payas, we call it payas.
Yeah. And so, he became a real sort of conundrum to psychoanalysts. What is this? What's going on with this guy? Is this a psychosis, a neurosis? How is it that he is like a chameleon, that he can change form and shape to fit in with every? So I chose that movie because I think, Woody Allen famously has been in psychoanalysis his entire life, and look at what good it's done him. But because I think that it's a really nice way to illustrate a dynamic that a lot of us people go through that we ordinarily identify as a kind of what used to be called neurosis. And neurosis, it's an antiquated term in psychiatry, refers to those disorders where a person does not feel a sense of self-acceptance. They doubt their will. In other words, I'm not sure if I should do this. They're self-doubting. I don't believe in my perceptions. I don't have confidence in my reality, so to speak. So I thought this movie by Woody Allen was a great illustration of neurosis.
Well, you make a differentiation between Sigmund Freud, who is really, like, we use his name colloquially because we all know him. But the father of this negative will was an acolyte of Sigmund Freud, Otto Frank, and he perceived as the father of this concept of negative will?
Well, his name is Rank.
Rank. What did I say?
Frank. It's okay.
So Otto Rank.
And see, right there, that speaks to his obscurity, doesn't it?
You are correct. I'd never heard his name, and I doubt that many of our viewers have heard his name. But you do call him the father of this construct. Talk a little bit about that. How did that come about?
Yeah, well, Rank actually was a follower. He was a generation younger than Freud, but he became a really integral member of Freud's inner circle. Um, he was the secretary of the Psychoanalytic Society for many years until he broke away from psychoanalysis altogether. Um, so Freud, as we all know, was sort of the founder of psychoanalysis. And what is psychoanalysis? It's introspection and analyzing our thoughts and our motives, right? Our subconscious mind, through our dreams, etc. Otto Rank felt that this actually has some problems in it. So he wrote a book with one of his associates to discuss the various kinds of experiments they were doing, he and his associate Sander Ferenczi, in trying to work with psychoanalysis and try different ways of techniques of working with patients.
I think at one point it's described, he describes psychoanalysis as paralysis by analysis,
right.
Which is, I mean, that's commonly used also, paralysis by analysis.
Yeah, I don't know if he actually used that term. I use it, but it's a commonly used term to refer to Rank's criticism of Freud. Rank felt that actually psychoanalysis could be what we call iatrogenic, that it only makes us more self-conscious, more self-doubting. And I think there's a lot of truth to that. I think there's a lot of value in introspection, and I'm certainly a proponent of psychoanalysis or psychoanalytic therapy. But it also it has its limits, and it can become a sort of a pastime in and of itself at the expense of actually changing our lives. So there's a famous psychoanalyst, Fred Pine, who passed away recently, who talks about that, in his final writings before he died. That's, he would analyze patients, but it would get him just so far. And sometimes you have to come to a point where you have to focus on what action is a patient making to bring change. So Otto Rank believed that was a limitation of psychoanalysis. In fact, that he even made people worse, more self-conscious. So his therapy was focused on his innovations in therapy, in helping patients to believe in themselves and take action with the will. So the will is an antiquated concept. It's from the 19th century philosophy. Schopenhauer and Nietzsche were the ones who mainly talked about it. And Rank, who was a follower of existentialism, adapted this concept, the will, and used it in his brand of psychoanalysis called will therapy.
So what exactly is this? What exactly is will? Like, how do I define my will? What is my will?
Well, it's a throwback to the 19th century. So the will, according to Schopenhauer, was the will to live. The will, according to Nietzsche, is the will to power. It is the basic life force, if you will. So if a person is not embracing their will, what Ron called the negative will, a person is, in a sense, kind of squelching or denying their life force.
So why would a person deny their life force, defined as their will, life force and will? Like, what would make me not do my will?
Well, as I was saying, Otto Rank's answer to that would be we'd be thinking about ourselves and analyzing ourselves too much. The more and more we question in our motives and our thoughts, the more self-conscious and self-doubting we become. That's the iatrogenic aspect of psychoanalysis. But at a deeper sense, Rank's influence was Friedrich Nietzsche, the 19th century philosopher, who had a very jaundiced view of civilization. And he felt that modern civilization has invested in itself in leveraging power by squelching the will of its constituents, of people. Um, so modern civilization is dried up. It is rife with negative will, and the institutions of society and civilization that are its instruments are religion and science, because religion teaches us to follow the dictates, in Christianity, for example, of Jesus, to be humble, to be meek. The meek shall inherit the earth. Well, Nietzsche felt that that was just a ruse to keep people in check for the sake of leveraging power in those aspects of society that already have power. So it makes people sheepish.
So, in line with that, you mentioned religion. Um, these are all social constructs. The religion is a social construct. Could you put in that social construct also politics? You know, the concept that we have a government, is that a social construct that can sort of bear down on our personal will? Would that be also included in that definition?
I think so. I think that unfortunately, in today's world, it's kind of fast forwarding in my paper on this topic, but I think that we're seeing a lot of that today. So back in the 1950s, there was a psychologist, Theodore Adorno, who wrote a book called The Authoritarian Personality in the wake of fascism in World War II, to study how is it that dogmatism, how is it that people follow these autocratic rulers? What causes fascism? Um, so, he studied this kind of sort of relinquishing of one's power for the sake of giving someone else's power who has power by proxy. And so one can identify with a powerful ruler, but the price one pays for that is one's autonomy. So one becomes a slave to an ideology, a political ideology. And in fascism, usually it's based on nationalism, some kind of another era when we were great. So let's make us great as a civilization once again. So just relinquish your power to me, and I will deliver you from all the corruption in our current society that represent change that's corrupt from a truer, purer identity.
So these influences that you're talking about are everywhere. They're in politics, they're in religion, they're in social constructs, they're in our neighborhood. Why is one person more susceptible to them than another person? Like, what is the genesis of this kind of susceptibility?
Well, Rob doesn't go into as much detail as Freud would and many of his followers about childhood experiences per se. He was more philosophical. He did say, grant that young children, are generally predominantly negative in their will because they don't have a good sense of self yet. So power, like the terrible twos, becomes important to children, but they don't have a sense of identity to attach to it. So their will is more oppositional. So if a child, presumably, is not encouraged, and this is Gordon Neufeld in his institute in Vancouver, who has a program for parents to help children and families develop children with a sense of autonomy so that they don't become resentful and oppositional, or they lose their sense of power. So if children are given the opportunity to learn how to gain a sense of themselves and embrace their will without it being oppositional, they have a voice, and they learn how to channel their will in ways that are uh, acceptable, that they're constructive, um, that a child can develop a healthy sense of self rather than feeling resentful towards a power that's greater than themselves, and that resentment, therefore, is becomes the seed of negative will, of resentment in adulthood, resenting anyone else who is powerful, who is free. And so enlisting a powerful ruler to squelch freedom, and that is an expression of resentment, which ostensibly is an expression of power, but underneath, according to Nietzsche, it's really a resentment, a jealousy and a resentment towards others who have freedom that one doesn't allow oneself to express.
Wow. That's all I can say is wow, because it seems like this is pretty common in our society. I mean, the concept of an oppositional child, I mean, that's not new. And parents going to psychologists, psychotherapists to figure out what they can do. But it must be, people must be born with that negative oppositional way. I mean, can you get that out of a person? Because you're expressing that as you get older, that changes and it can express itself in many different dysfunctional ways.
Well, I think we're all born with a will, if you will. We have a life force within us. But whether it eventuates into a negative or positive will is determined by first our families, our parents, how we're raised, and our society. All those factors go into a determination of how it's expressed. So if we are accepted as we are, rather than we're told that we're not good the way that we are, we're going to deny ourselves. We're going to reject ourselves, aren't we? Because that becomes internalized. Whereas if we are loved and accepted, but with an understanding that we cannot just do whatever we want, the socialization process means that we have to channel our will in ways that are constructive. That gives a child going into adulthood a sense of empowerment, feeling that they're good enough, that they're good, that they love themselves, so that they don't develop a basic, tendency to feel jealous and envious and resentful, so that they try to, they extend that sense of not loving themselves into their relationships with others. It becomes a very destructive force. And so, to me, I believe this is the source of personality disorders. In 2009, I published an article in Psychoanalytic Review proposing that we reconceptualize how we think of personality disorders along a spectrum, if you will, that follows this framework of negative will. So that what distinguishes a creative person, a person who's self-accepting, as opposed to one who has a quote unquote personality disorder, is the extent to which our sense of accepting ourselves extends into our relationships with others. And then I also offered this model to extend Rock's concept of negative will, which was exclusively directed towards those who squelch their own will, that deny their own will, the neurotics, so to speak, towards those disorders, personality disorders, what's called cluster B.
Repeat that word. I don't know that word. What is it? Clustered?
Cluster B, letter B. It's in the sort of the nomenclature of personality disorders in the DSM, such as narcissistic personality, antisocial, histrionic, etc. So I propose this model also to extend Rock's application of negative will to the cluster B personality disorders such as narcissism and antisocial personality, those individuals who do not squelch their own will, but rather try to squelch the will of others, leverage power over others through various means associated with those personality disorders, such as deceitfulness, uh, um, violence, or bullying, or all various kinds of manipulative measures to squelch the power of others, to deny the will of others, as opposed to neurosis, which is denying the will of oneself.
Well, I see that this is very, very complex, and I can see that there's many people who have that. So, like you said, it's on the spectrum of psychological of dysfunction. People who take this inner sort of thought process and either squelch others or squelch themselves. Must be very, very difficult to cure someone of something like that because it's so deep.
Well, uh, to cure someone, I don't, maybe, I mean,
Is that the wrong word, cure? That's a colloquial term, to cure?
yeah, I don't know if there is a cure. I mean, so the concept of will is philosophical, it's not medical. Um, so, one of the reasons that I proposed this concept, the will, in psychotherapy and personality, is to take psychology as a field a little bit away from the medicalization of how we see ourselves and our problems and disorders, and bring it back to psychology's origins in philosophy. Um, so the cure becomes a concept of cure is irrelevant, but rather it's a process. So Rank, for example, believed that this is part of a universal process of becoming an individual, and that we're all born. He wrote a book called The Trauma of Birth, and it's all about the lifelong process of becoming individuals. That we always are dealing with our struggle between wanting to belong, wanting acceptance, what he called the collective, as opposed to breaking away, what Ron called the hero, the artist, and becoming oneself, what Woody Allen Zelig was unable to do. It's a lifelong process. We're always struggling with this, and this is what life is all about. So there isn't any cure per se. It's an existential dilemma that we have to figure out, and we're always struggling with. And we see it played out now in politics throughout the world, and it's reaching a tipping point now in the world. People are at odds at a point, of violence, because we cannot tolerate each other's viewpoints of what our sense of responsibility and freedom are to others and to ourselves. Um, so it is a lot about, this freedom, our individuality, who, our rights to express ourselves, as opposed to our sense of what are our obligations to one another, the collective.
I'm hearing I'm hearing the basic conflict in everybody. One, of being yourself, but two, of not being yourself so totally that you're infringing on someone else's will. And that struggle, well, that's complicated if your negative will is really oppositional. But most people, like you said very well, you said they're on the spectrum. You're on the spectrum and you balance both those things. And hopefully, your creative will, I'm using a new word, creative will, is able to express itself. And at the same time, you're able to be a good citizen.
Yeah, I think so. I think ultimately what Ron called the creative self is to learn how to navigate these dilemmas with one's own belief in oneself, that you have the capability to do that without conforming to others or without becoming autocratic and forcing other people to follow your rule. Um, and neither extreme is viable. And to me, that is a cardinal feature of what a personality disorder is. The inability to be able to negotiate the tensions between those two ends of the spectrum. And that is not an easy thing to do. It means that we have to use our wits and judgment. It takes a lot of experience, introspection, and experience to be able to do that skillfully. But that is part and parcel of what it means to become a human, a successful human, to mature into that process. Um, so, yeah, it is a challenge. And it is, again, I'm offering this as a concept to help us to understand that the things that we struggle with and try to understand as psychologists uh, is part of something that is universal, of what it means to be a human being.
What I'm hearing is that you get born, you have a certain negative will, you have a will, and you meet your parents and your siblings and anyone who's closest to you, and they have a will also, and somehow you adapt around and about it. But sometimes you're not successful, and that causes like the problems we have in society. But really, you bring yourself up. Your parents start you off, but you have to, in the end, bring yourself up. You have to be the force. That's what I'm hearing from you.
Yeah, I think ultimately we are alone. That's right. However, uh, you know, our upbringing from our parents has a major influence on what direction that takes, and the society we live in, the government, the religious institutions also help foster. So, I mean, Nietzsche's critique again, let's say, of religion, is it doesn't, that it squelches the will. That's his critique of modern civilization. So there are these different forces in society, in families, communities, political and religious institutions that have an influence on what direction that will eventuates towards.
I'm happy that you brought it up. It's something no one was familiar with, and I think it's an important point of knowledge for bringing ourselves up and understanding ourselves. That we're all born with this. So thank you, Dr. Hamm, and I'm always looking forward to what you have, what you bring up, because it's always interesting. And thank you.